So, animation superpowers with React Spring. First, very briefly about myself. I've been working in the industry for about 9 years now. As of recently, I am senior front-end engineer at Giraffe 360, and I would say definitely that animation is a topic in software engineering that I'm extremely passionate about. So first, let's touch upon the various ways of animating in the web. I think the thing that most people learn first is some CSS animations, and in particular, it's usually CSS transitions, which is typically done to add different hover effects on buttons or animate them when you have some sort of a pseudo class, and it's usually pretty basic, although it can also be quite powerful if you combine it with something like a front-end framework. Now, something that's more advanced is the CSS animation API, aka keyframes. And I don't know about you guys, but I remember when I first learned about keyframes and just the overview of the API and saw how different developers are using it to create lots of very unique, creative, visually stunning animations, I was rather mind blown, I would say. But it also does have its limitations, mostly due to it being pure CSS, so you don't have the full power of JavaScript when you're using them. So that leads us to the next part, which is that you can animate things with JavaScript as well. And the typical, most low-level way of doing it is doing it with request animation frame, which is a browser API where the browser basically runs it approximately 60 times per second. And this is actually the way that most animation libraries do their animations underneath the hood. Then there is the web animation API, and actually, as I was making this presentation, I wasn't aware of this, but this is the very same thing as the CSS animation API. It's the same thing as keyframes, only you're calling the same APIs within JavaScript. And it's also worth mentioning that some animation libraries use this web animation API underneath the hood instead of request animation frame. And this brings us to the third main way of animating things within JavaScript, which is just using a library. Because let's be honest, you probably mostly want to just focus on the animations and what you're animating instead of the low-level details. So I would like to address why I picked a React-specific library, and my answer to that question is this graph. Most likely, if you've been doing anything on the web, especially if you have a job, then you've probably been writing React at some point, or you will have to write it at some point. And it's by far more popular than all of the other frameworks combined. So why not pick an animation library that works incredibly well with what you're gonna eventually be using anyway? So you might ask, why React Spring? What's so special about this animation library? Well, unlike most animation libraries which use durations and easings, what React Spring does, it actually uses spring physics. So much like a spring of a car that would smooth out the bump in a road for its passengers, you provide certain parameters. It's optional, but you provide certain parameters to the library which describe the spring physics, and basically the next value, and the library handles the animation for you. But as I was making this presentation, I actually started thinking that that just talking about animations is like dancing about architecture. doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we will check out the first example, and well, there will be lots of examples. This is actually the first example, and as you can see, we have a certain cat over here who is swimming for some fish in the ocean, and the way it's made right now in this app component is that wherever you click, that's where the cat teleports. Oh. The code is not that important right now, so what you would do with React Spring to make the cat move, this is the animated app. It's like a couple of lines of code actually. Once you activate the animated app, you can make the cat move. And what's really cool about this is actually, this is something very specific to React Spring. If mid-animation the target to which the cat should be going to changes, then the animation engine just really smoothly adjusts the course of the cat. So let me show you. So if you would be using easings and durations, then the change would be quite abrupt and would have like a sharp corner. We'll see that a bit later. And what's really actually neat about this library is that at first, as you'll be learning it, you don't need to worry about the Spring physics, but at some point I think it does become quite fun to actually start experimenting with the different parameters and like getting a feel for what they do. But in the middle point, you can actually use various Spring configs which you pass to the library. And there's some which are quite fun. I would say, for example, this wobbly one, which makes the cat go in a really wobbly way. And like this is something that would be impossible to do with just pure CSS. And I would say like most animation libraries in JavaScript also wouldn't be able to achieve it. One quick maybe caveat is that you can use durations and easings, as you can see over here, but it will have the negative effect of, well, for example, when you're using, when the path to travel is very small, it will have the same duration as the travel path that's very long. So that's one thing which is just not how things in the real world move. And to show once again the example about changing the target mid-animation, so again, it has this sharp turn which just isn't as smooth, doesn't look as nice. And yeah, maybe I'll not show this example, but it's actually this example that I just showed with the sharp turn. It's also completely possible with React and CSS transition, but you get basically identical behavior. And I'll actually quickly show, I coded this like third version of the app really quick after work before this event because I just had nothing to do. And this is like 60 lines of code where the cat follows the mouse, and you can see that its friends are like following it in a staggered way. And if you stop, then they all go to the same position. And yeah, as you can see, it's 60 lines of code. Really simple stuff. So that's the basic example of the behavior. Well, what else? Well, React Spring is actually made by the Poimandres Dev Collective, whom you might know as the authors of Zustand, which is, I think at this point, everyone's favorite state management library. Can everyone who's using Zustand and liking it maybe raise your hand? Really? So few? This is actually a surprise to me, because yeah, I know like in my previous job we started using it, and so at the new company that I'm working in, we're also using it over there. And as far as I know, it's like really popular. But okay, fair enough. They're also the authors of React 3 Fiber, which is a React renderer for 3JS. And I would say that these days it's by far the easiest way of doing 3D things in the web. And they're also the authors of a really neat library called UseGesture. UseGesture is framework and animation library agnostic, so you can use it with any animation library, and you can use it with Vanilla.js or outside of React or with Angular, but it also works incredibly well with React Spring. And as you can see in this example, this is drag and drop implemented completely in a custom way without using any type of drag and drop library. With these two libraries, with React Spring and UseGesture, and so it would be really easy to add any type of custom behaviors that you would want, because it's a completely custom implementation, and I would say it's relatively simple actually. And they're just the authors of a lot more cool stuff. So I think anything that they create is worth paying attention to. What's also quite significant is that React Spring supports not just React DOM as its renderer. So it's capable of running not only in the browser, but most importantly, I think you can learn React Spring in the browser, and then if you're using React Native to build a mobile app or a native desktop app, you can reuse the same mental model for animating things over there. So you don't have to learn a new animation library, you don't have to learn anything new, it just works out of the box. React Spring also has bindings for React 3 Fiber, which we mentioned previously. So if you want to build a 3D scene which is animated, and most probably, let's be honest, when we're making a 3D scene, we do want to animate it. So yeah, you can reuse the same mental model over there as well. These are the two outside of browser use cases that I have used it for, so I can vouch that they work really well. But it also does have bindings for React Conva and React ZDog, which are for drawing complex 2D canvas graphics within the browser. And actually, if you're feeling adventurous and you're using some sort of a really exotic React renderer for which React Spring does not have bindings for, there are docs for you. I checked it, it's like pretty simple. It is possible to make your own bindings between like a custom React renderer and React Spring. So very quickly, I would like to also demonstrate an example of just a lot of animation orchestration and how animations interact with how animations interact. What was I about to say? With different user gestures in a 3D environment. So this is like a side project that I was building a while ago. It's not finished, but it works quite well. So off the top of, like on the first screen, you can see that, so in a 3D environment, you can see that it has a camera. And the camera in this case, it's like the movement of the camera is animated based on the mouse position. And what's really neat is, since it's bound, the position is bound to a spring. Let me show it in the following way. If it would follow the mouse position directly, if I were to move away and move my mouse back in, it would, like the change would be instant. But since the movement is bound to a spring, the update of the camera position will be gradual and really smooth. So check this out. Which is just a really nice thing to have. Other than that, this zooming is done with React Spring. Different objects move in different ways and directions based off of scroll position. This thing here appears when it reaches a certain threshold. This MacBook starts rotating based on scroll position, so it's completely continuous and gradual. And yeah, you can animate things based off of user interaction as well. And at least for me personally, yeah, I don't know, it's hard to imagine animating all of this with any other library other than React Spring. And I would say a lot of this isn't even that advanced. It is like a bit of work, but it's nothing that incredibly advanced with this library. Another thing that it has going for it is that compared to its direct competition, it has a slightly smaller bundle size. So it's, I would say, most direct competitors is GSAP, which is the OG animation library, and also just Framer Motion and its successor Motion. And compared to all of those, React Spring has the smallest bundle size. Well, what about other animation libraries? And sure, there's like a lot of other libraries, but as far as I know, most of them are not physics-based, so you cannot have all of this smoothness and these lifelike animations, especially when you're basing it off of like different dynamic user interactions. They're not as React friendly. A good example of this is, for example, GSAP. Like, it does have official bindings for React, but they do result in quite a bit more boilerplate. And I would say, like, you want as little boilerplate as possible. Yeah, many of the more advanced use cases just, they're not as simple to make. That's maybe my personal opinion, but that's what it is. And actually, a lot of them cannot even be used outside of the DOM and the browser. And in my opinion, one really important thing that the library also has going for it is that it has the use transition hook, or you can use the transition component. They're basically the same thing. And you can use them to improve the performance of your app, especially if like slower machines are a concern for you. And while still doing like in and out animations. And a good example of this is modals which appear and disappear in certain side menus. So what React Spring will do, and we'll see this a bit later in one of the examples ahead, is as it animates an element out, as the animation has finished, it actually unrenders it. So there's no longer, when it disappears, there's no longer the extra overhead that it might be like processing something. It might not be fetching before it has appeared. It will not be fetching anything or doing any sort of calculations, which I have seen cases where it does create like a noticeable effect. And with this, let's check out the most basic API of React Spring. It should be actually, it's trying to spin it up over there. This is the same thing. Let's open it in a new tab. So we have this Spotify clone. Most of it is like non-interactive, which is fine for us. Crucially, you have this side menu over here, which opens and closes based on the button click. So this is the non-animated version. Is it possible to see the code? Is it okay? Okay. Let's zoom in. Is this okay? Okay. So the way this is done, as you might guess, it's pretty simple. You have a state, have a couple of places where the state is triggered to true or false, and the side menu is just conditionally rendered based on the state. So the way you would implement an animation with this, with React Spring, first let's check out the example. So pretty basic, nothing special. You still have the same state. You would import the use Spring hook from the library, and you would pass a parameter to it. And this can be a CSS property. It can be anything you want it to be. The name of it can be anything you want it to be. And then the value is typically a numeric value. And in this most simple example, we're conditionally rendering it based on this state. So if the side menu is open, it will be 0. It will be completely on the right side. And if the side menu will be closed, it will be minus 400, 400 being the width of the menu. So it will just go completely off screen. And the use Spring hook will return a very similar object that you passed. It will have all of the same keys, but instead of the numeric value, it will have a Spring value object assigned to it. And this style object you would pass into the style of an animated div. And the animated, by the way, is just also imported from the library. It has all of the tags that are HTML tags, divs, spans, h1s, etc. Yeah, and that's just how it works. But okay, you might wonder like what to do in a case where you want to run an animation that is not directly based off of a state change, like over here. Actually, before we go into that, I will demonstrate just what's happening underneath the hood when we run the animation. So we're logging out the different states of the animation. So as it enters, it just runs continuously many times until it reaches the target position, in this case 0. And as we're closing it, once again, same thing, and it just runs it really fast many times. So yeah, what to do if you don't want to just do it based off of state updates, but you want to do it directly based off of some user interactions. Maybe you want to run some animation right after fetching it. You do it in a use effect hook, maybe put it in a set timeout. So in this case, you would use the use Spring imperative API, and this will most probably be how you will be doing most animations with React Spring. And in this case, instead of passing an object into use Spring, you're passing a function which returns an object. And the object just contains the initial state. So in this case, right will be 0. And if you pass this function, then it will return, the use Spring hook will return a tuple where the first item will be that very same style object, and the second item will be the API, which you will be using to update the state of the Spring. And so to replicate the behavior which we saw in the previous example. In this case, we have a useEffect hook, which runs every time the side menu open state changes, and once again we're conditionally just passing either 0 or minus 400. So we have it over here, and once again we have the same behavior. In this example also I did add this line. So what it will do is it will do something extra without updating any state once you click on one of the items. So let's check it out. So I think this is obviously a bit silly, but I think it's a good demonstration of how to do animation and Spring updates without doing direct React state updates. Next, let's check out the use transition example, which I mentioned previously. So in this case, we are using the use transition hook, and we're passing the state into it, and in the config you specify basically the initial state, you specify a truthy state and a falsy state, and the use transition hook returns a function in which you conditionally render your side menu. And the style object will be passed into its callback. So here, seemingly, we have the same behavior as before, but crucially, there is a nuance. Let's check this out. We can see the side menu is being rendered over here, but as we pay attention to this, as we're going to close the side menu, it animates out, and once it finishes, it actually unrenders. It disappears from the DOM, and the use transition, function will actually even unmount this component once it finishes animating. So this component will no longer be doing anything. This is how you achieve the previously mentioned performance benefit. And so lastly, also the use transition hook is really neat for rendering and animating lists of items. So let's check this example. In this case, we're going to see the list animate in. And so React Spring will take care of items disappearing from the list of items. And if there was like some logic that would add items to the array, then they would also animate in. And this example, okay, this will be the same. This is the animated side menu where we're rendering the list. Basically, we just have an array of songs. We're passing that array into use transition. Oh, and before I proceed, two things. One, if you want to animate a custom component instead of one of the DOM primitives, you just wrap the custom component within the animated higher order function, and it will make it so the component knows when a Spring value is passed as one of the props, and it will be able to react to it and animate based off of the Spring values updates. And also what's quite neat is that mostly you will be passing numbers to the Spring configs, but you can pass strings. And as long as it's something that can be resolved into a bunch of numbers, the library is smart enough to handle it for you. So in this case, we're animating a bunch of things, including margins, and the library will be able to animate them even though we're passing strings. And I haven't tested this myself, but it's in the docs. You can even pass CSS variables. So yeah, in this case, yeah, we pass an array into use transition, and in this case, you can look at transitions function as just array.map, only it is smart enough to know which elements it should be rendering. And yeah, we saw the example, and I think what's really cool about this is if mid-animation, as it's animating out, some other logic triggers that re-adds that item into the array, the library will be smart enough to very, very smoothly just start animating that same element back in, which in my opinion is really cool. And lastly, let's do it like this. Lastly, you might ask, okay, you typically pass the Spring values into the style object, but what if you want to animate something other than a style property? Well, it's possible to pass Spring values as absolutely anything. You can pass it as any prop, and in this case, we're passing the amount Spring value into children, and we can see it directly animating in the DOM. But what to do if, like in a case like this, we have the U1 screen, but I think it would make sense that first of all we wouldn't have these decimals, which just makes it look ugly, and to have some sort of a currency that the person won. So in this case, you can use the to method of the Spring value object. And in this method, you just pass a callback, and this callback will again execute with each iteration of the animation. And you can just apply any type of transformations you want within the callback. So in this case, we're doing math floor to remove the decimal digits, and we're applying the euro sign to it. Let's save this and rerun. So yeah, no decimals and a euro sign. And lastly, I think, I don't know about you, but I've many times run into this problem, especially when doing CSS keyframes, that let's say you want to animate the same property but with two different animations. And a typical case for this is CSS transforms. For example, yeah, you want to do a translate with two things, or let's say a translate and a rotate. And when these two animations happen together, one of the animations actually overrides the other one, and it just makes for a really janky experience. And yeah, typically the way you would solve it is like just applying it to different elements, but in this case we don't, like that can create its own problems. In this case, React Spring handles it very smoothly. So it has this to function helper in which you pass, as the first argument, you pass an array of Spring values, and the second argument is a callback where each value of the current iteration is being passed as the argument. And yeah, we have this mouse Y. All you have to know about this is just it follows the mouse's vertical movement within this page. And in this case, we're combining them by multiplying them. So let's see how this works. Let's rerun. It animates first on mount, and then as we enter with the mouse, it's going to start multiplying the values. And you can do anything you want with it and combine animations in whichever way you want, which is, I think, really cool, and it's really nice that it's just so simple to do it with React Spring. Well, that's it for the overview of the API. There are many things, many more APIs, helpers, functions, hooks within the library, but I think, at least from personal experience, most of the stuff that you will be animating with this library, like the real-world use cases, those are the ones we just touched upon. And so with this, next, let's just check out something more chill, something that doesn't require as much attention. I think it's always really inspiring to see really cool examples of just what other people are able to come up with a library and creative ways that people are able to use it. And the first example is the React iPhone. So this is someone built just the most core interactions of the iPhone with React Spring, but in the web. So it has this, and you'll notice even the background is animating, which is what iOS has as well. Have this here, the swiping. I think it's quite cool that iOS, which is also known for its really cool and smooth animations, the same thing is completely possible with a single library in the browser. Yeah, and I actually did, I don't know about now, but I remember seeing this example a few years ago and actually opening it on my phone, and I was surprised that it also worked super smoothly on my phone. And yeah, the next one is a parallax example. So basically what it is, it's elements moving at different speeds, and it does create a sense of movement, which is very much how, and a sense of depth between the elements, which is how things happen in real life. So let's check it out. As we're scrolling, the clouds, the satellite, all of the difference move at various speeds. I think when I first saw a parallax example on the web, my mind was completely blown. And this is also quite neat. And I think what's really cool, so these are just bindings from the React Spring library. And I don't know about you guys, but this seems like very simple code. It's really cool that you can do this type of parallax with just a bunch of declarative code. Yeah, and with this, I think it's worthwhile addressing some of the cons of React Spring. And one is that it is initially, the learning curve is definitely on the steep side. As you check out the code, if you're not used to it, you can be left scratching your head. There is no easy way to use it outside of React. And in a perfect world, I would wish that it would be framework agnostic. Maybe someday someone will create something like that, because there is no inherent way why all of this Spring physics stuff cannot be done within Angular or Svelte or whatever. And then maybe like some sort of a binding library to each framework. But currently, the way, yeah, it is what it is, unfortunately. So if bundle size is a serious consideration for you and you're doing just something basic, then yeah, there is the cost of the additional bundle size. And if you're doing something basic, I would just opt for pure CSS, the animations most likely, or some basic JavaScript and React request animation frame. Yeah, that's the next slide. Oh, okay, yeah, right. So for slower machines, the web animation API will probably, there might be like slightly better performance with that. React Spring uses request animation frame underneath the hood, so that's just something to keep in mind. And then, yeah, as of around 2014, you can, with just pure CSS transitions, animate elements from 0 or just any value to auto, so you don't have to care about how big the element will be with all of the content that it is inside of it. If you don't know about this and you're interested in that, there's a bunch of references. You'll probably be able to get the presentation slides afterwards. You can check it out or you can Google it. It's actually a really neat thing. And just using any animation library in a case like that is just harder. But yeah, to reiterate, the main strengths of React Spring is that it uses Spring physics instead of easings and durations, which allows you to create really dynamic, really lifelike animations, which is more like how things move in real life. You can reuse the same mental model. You can learn React Spring once in the DOM and then use it to make a React Native app. You can use it in the React 3 Fiber in a 3D scene. I think that's very efficient, and just reusing the same skill set is something that I'm a very strong proponent of. And it's super easy to achieve really advanced animations and advanced behaviors, such as interoperating with gestures and combining multiple animations into one. All of this with React Spring is actually relatively simple. And yeah, that's mostly it. In conclusion, I would like to say that it's really cool to watch presentations and maybe just see some examples. But what's even more powerful is that if you go to the docs, and in the docs there's actually lots of really good examples which you can really easily spin up on CodePen. You can experiment, check out yourself, spin up a project, and if you spend some time with it and just get an understanding of it, I really promise you that you will achieve animation superpowers. Thank you.